The ventilation shaft of Larkspur Way Station smelled of ozone, recycled oxygen, and the faint, sweet rot of hydroponic fertilizer that had seen better decades. It was the smell of a station slowly dying, suffocating under the weight of its own bureaucracy. Yet Rhett Calder found it strangely comforting. It smelled like honesty. Up in the spire, where the air scrubbers were perfumed with synthetic lilac, and the gravity plating was calibrated to a soothing 1.0, everything was a lie. Down here in the bowels of Sector 12, at least the rust was real. Rhett shifted his weight, groaning, as his left knee clicked a souvenir from a shrapnel burst on the moon of Typhon 3. He jammed his hydrospanner into the coupling of the atmospheric regulator. The machine hissed, spitting a jet of hot steam that would have scalded a lesser man, but Rhett's hands were covered in calluses, thick enough to stop a vibroblade. "Easy, you piece of junk," Rhett muttered, his voice a gravelly rasp that sounded like rocks tumbling inside a mixer. "Don't make me strip you down to your motherboard." The regulator whined a high-pitched mechanical protest before shuddering into compliance. The red warning light on its console flickered and died, replaced by a steady, sullen green. Rhett wiped a smear of grease from his forehead, leaving a black streak across his pale, scarred skin. He tapped the comms unit clipped to his heavy utility belt. "Maintenance ticket 49 Alpha is cleared," he said. "The atmosphere is stable in the lower market. Tell the residents they can stop holding their breath." The voice of the dispatcher crackled in his ear, bored and tinny. "Copy that, Calder. Don't get comfortable. Dispatching you to the Interspecies Academy in Sector 9. The HVAC unit in the cafeteria is rattling again. Priority 4. Rhett sighed, leaning his head back against the cold metal of the shaft wall. "A school? Come on, Miller. Send the rookie. I hate schools. Too much screaming. Too much hope." "Rookie is busy fixing the executive toilet in the spire. You are the only one free. Get moving, Calder, or I dock your credits for insubordination." Rhett cut the connection. He considered for a brief and tempting second, simply ignoring the order, and retreating to his cramped quarters to drink the sludge that passed for coffee and stare at the bulkhead until sleep took him. But credits were credits, and even a ghost needed to eat. He crawled out of the maintenance hatch, dropping 2 meters to the deck plates with a heavy thud that rattled his teeth. He stood up, stretching to his full height. He was a large man, broad-shouldered and imposing, though he did his best to slouch to shrink inside his stained gray jumpsuit. He wore his hair long and unkempt, a messy curtain of gray and black designed to hide his face. He wanted to be invisible. He wanted to be just another cog in the machine, a grease monkey named Rhett, who fixed toilets and regulators and knew nothing of orbital bombardment vectors or fleet maneuvers. He was not Rhett Calder, the Starbreaker. He was not the man who had shattered the Kitsari blockade at the Nebula of Tears. That man had died 10 years ago, buried under a mountain of metals and a sea of blood. This man, the one wiping his hands on a rag, just wanted to be left alone. As he walked through the corridors of the lower market towards the transit lift, the reality of Larkspur Way Station pressed in on him. It was a place of transition, a purgatory between the rigid, militaristic order of the human Concord and the exotic, chaotic beauty of the Kitsari Star Empire. 10 years of peace had technically existed between the two superpowers, but it was a peace built on paper, held together by spit and suspicion. Larkspur was where the debris of that peace washed up. The lower market was a riot of noise and color. Neon signs in standard, and the flowing script of Kitsari flickered erratically. Stalls sold synthetic protein paste, scavenged tech, and dubious charms meant to ward off void sickness. Rhett moved through the crowd like a stone in a river, the flow of humanity and aliens parting around him. He saw weary human refugees from the border colonies, their clothes patched and gray. He saw Kitsari laborers, their fox-like ears flattened against their skulls in exhaustion, their bushy tails dragging on the dirty floor. Above them, projected on massive holoscreens that dominated the ceiling, was the smiling face of Herod Vale, the station master. Vale was a handsome man in the way a shark was handsome, sleek, polished, and predatory. "Citizens of Larkspur," the holographic veil, boomed his voice, modulated to a perfect, soothing baritone. "The Orion Trade Guild reminds you that efficiency is the key to prosperity. Our partner, the Ledger Prime algorithm, has recalculated the daily caloric distribution to ensure maximum station sustainability. Remember, a hungry station is a working station. Report any resource hoarding to your local peacekeeper." Rhett spat on the floor. Ledger Prime, the invisible tyrant. A super algorithm designed to manage the complex logistics of a trade hub, but tweaked by Orion to squeeze every last drop of profit from the populace. It treated people like variables in an equation. If the profit margin dipped by 0.1%, Ledger Prime cut rations for the orphanage. It was cold, it was mathematical, and it was cruel. And the worst part, the part that made Rhett's stomach twist with a familiar acidic guilt, was that the core logic of Ledger Prime, the Cascade Grid, was something he recognized. He had written the tactical precursor to it during the war. He had designed a system to strangle enemy supply lines by calculating the exact caloric minimum needed to break a population's will to fight. Now, his weapon of war was being used to manage a grocery list. He reached the transit lift and jammed his thumb against the call button. The doors hissed open, revealing a crammed car. He squeezed in, towering over a pair of nervous reptilian traders. The lift groaned and began its descent toward Sector 9. The Interspecies Academy was a grand name for a series of converted cargo bays. It was a place where the children of the station, human Kitsari, and a dozen other minor species were dumped, while their parents worked 18-hour shifts in the orbital docks. The walls were painted a cheerful, peeling yellow, covered in murals of humans and aliens holding hands under a smiling sun. It was the kind of propaganda that made Rhett want to retch. He found the cafeteria easily enough. He just followed the noise. It was lunch hour. The air was thick with the smell of rehydrated soy meat and the deafening roar of 300 children shouting, laughing, and banging trays. Rhett stood in the doorway, his toolbox heavy in his hand. He scanned the room, looking for the maintenance access panel for the HVAC unit. It was located on the far wall behind the serving line. He pulled his cap lower, trying to shield his eyes from the chaos. "Excuse me. Coming through. Watch your tail, kid." He waded through the sea of children. He saw human boys throwing peas at a young Kitsari girl, who hissed and bared tiny fangs. He saw a group of insectoid-heavy worlders sharing a block of mineral salt. It was a microcosm of the galaxy, messy and loud. He reached the HVAC unit and popped the panel. It was a simple fix, a loose fan belt causing the rattle. He could do it in his sleep. He worked quickly, his back to the room, trying to shut out the noise. He wanted to be done. He wanted to be gone. 10 minutes later, the unit was humming smoothly. Rhett snapped the panel shut and gathered his tools. He turned to leave, intending to march straight out the double doors and find the nearest bottle of synthetic whiskey. But his path was blocked. Or rather, his attention was snagged. In the far corner of the cafeteria, away from the noisy clusters of tables, there was a single small table pushed against a viewport that looked out into the black void of space. Sitting there entirely alone was a Kitsari child. She was small, perhaps 7 or 8 standard years old if she were human. Her fur was the color of a sunset on a dusty moon, a soft, pale orange that faded to cream around her muzzle and paws. Her ears, usually perky and alert in her species, were drooping low. Her large, bushy tail was wrapped tightly around her waist, a defensive gesture Rhett had seen 1,000 times in refugees. But it was what she was doing that made Rhett stop. On the table in front of her sat a lunchbox. It was an old, battered metal thing, the paint chipped away to reveal the gray alloy beneath. Someone had tried to make it pretty by sticking a holographic sticker of a shooting star on the lid, but the sticker was peeling at the edges. The girl was not eating. She was arranging invisible items on the table. She picked up a plastic spork and placed it with the precision of a diamond cutter. She smoothed out a napkin that was not there. She looked up, her large amber eyes, scanning the empty chair opposite her, and then she smiled. It was a practice smile, a customer service smile. Rhett felt a strange pull in his chest. He told his feet to move toward the exit. His feet, traitorous things, stayed planted. Then, against every instinct he had cultivated in his years of hiding, he took a step toward the table. Then another. He loomed over the table, his shadow falling across the little Kitsari. She flinched her ears, flattening completely, and looked up. Terror flashed in her eyes for a second, a primal fear of the large, scarred human. But she blinked it away instantly, replacing it with that bright, uncanny professional demeanor. "Welcome," she chirped. Her voice was high and musical, her standard fluent but accented with the rolling growls of her native tongue. "Do you have a reservation, sir? We are very busy today, but for a distinguished gentleman like yourself, I can find a table." Rhett looked around at the empty corner. "Busy, huh?" "Oh, yes," she said, seriously nodding her head. Her whiskers twitched. "The governor of the Alpha Centauri system is dining at the next table. He is very loud. I apologize in advance." Rhett looked at the empty space she indicated. He felt a corner of his mouth twitch. "I see. Well, I don't have a reservation." "That is acceptable," the girl said. She gestured grandly to the empty chair opposite her. "This is the VIP table. Best view in the house. I am Kiri. I will be your server and your chef today." Rhett hesitated. He should go. He was a 45-year-old ex-commander, with a bounty on his head officially retracted, but old enemies had long memories and a liver condition. He had no business playing make-believe with an alien child. But the look in her eyes was not just play. It was desperation masking itself as fantasy. It was a survival mechanism. He knew about those. He had lived inside one for a decade. With a grunt that sounded like a shifting tectonic plate, Rhett pulled out the small plastic chair and sat down. It creaked dangerously under his weight. He set his toolbox on the floor. "All right, Kiri," Rhett said. "I'm Rhett. What's special today?" Kiri clasped her paws together, her tail giving a tentative little wag. "Today, we have roast stellar pheasant with a reduction of nebula berry sauce, served with a side of crispy asteroid potatoes." "Sounds expensive," Rhett said. "For you on the house," she whispered conspiratorially. "Because you look like you have had a long shift. My mother says working men need extra protein." Rhett felt a phantom ache in his chest. "Your mother sounds smart." "She is the smartest," Kiri agreed. She reached for her battered lunchbox. "I have prepared the ingredients right here. It is time to plate the meal." She placed her small paws on the latches of the box. Rhett watched, expecting her to pull out a nutrient bar, or maybe a sandwich made of gray protein paste. That was what most kids on the station ate. It was bland, but it kept them alive. Kiri popped the latches. Click, click. She lifted the lid with a flourish like a magician revealing a dove. "Voila!" she exclaimed. Rhett looked inside. The box was empty. There was no pheasant, no nutrient bar, not even a crumb of bread. The metal interior was scraped clean, shining dully under the harsh cafeteria lights. Rhett froze. He looked at Kiri. She was still smiling, that bright, heartbreaking smile, miming the action of lifting a heavy roast out of the box. She placed the invisible food on her tray. She picked up her spork and began to cut the air, bringing an empty utensil to her mouth. She chewed enthusiastically. "Delicious," she said. "Do you want a bite, Mr. Rhett?" Rhett could not breathe. The air in the room seemed to have vanished. He looked back down at the lunchbox. There was something inside. It was not food. It was a small scrap of paper folded into a perfect square, tucked into the corner. "Kiri," Rhett said, his voice rougher than before. "You're eating." "It is the best pheasant I have ever cooked," she said, though her stomach let out a treacherous, audible growl. She ignored it with the grace of a queen. Rhett reached out a hand large and scarred, and gently touched the edge of the lunchbox. "May I?" Kiri stopped chewing. Her smile faltered, just for a fraction of a second. She looked at his hand, then at his face. She saw something there, perhaps the exhaustion that matched her own, and nodded. Rhett reached in and picked up the folded paper. "That is the bill," Kiri said quickly, her voice pitching up. "You do not have to pay it yet." Rhett unfolded the paper. It was a receipt from a recycling kiosk, the backside used for writing. The script had elegant, sharp-angled Kitsari characters that flowed down the page, but beneath them was a translation in shaky standard, written in cheap blue ink. "My little star. I am sorry." The shift was cut short. The credits did not clear. Ledger Prime denied the allocation request again. "There is no ration today. I will make it up tomorrow. I promise. Please imagine it is the feast we talked about. Love, Mom." Rhett stared at the words. Ledger Prime denied the allocation request. The algorithm. His algorithm. It had decided that this child, this bright-eyed little fox pretending to eat air, did not yield enough economic return to justify 400 calories of protein paste. His hand closed into a fist, crumpling the paper slightly. Anger, hot and old, began to ignite in his gut. It was a familiar fire, one he had thought extinguished by years of apathy. He went to smooth the paper back out to fold it, and put it back when his eye caught something in the bottom right corner of the note. It was a doodle. A tiny drawing made with the same cheap blue pen. Rhett blinked, his cybernetic eye zooming in, slightly focusing through the lens of his contact. It was not just a doodle. It was a crest. It was drawn hastily, the lines wavering, but the geometry was unmistakable to a man who had spent 20 years studying enemy iconography. It was a circle, intersected by 3 rising spears, crowned by a 9-pointed star. The royal seal of the Kitsari Star Empress. Rhett's blood ran cold. He looked around the cafeteria, suddenly paranoid. Was this a trap? Was this some kind of elaborate test? He looked back at the crest. It was drawn casually, like a signature, like a habit. A Kitsari laborer in the slums of Larkspur did not sign a starvation note with the crest of the ruling matriarch. That symbol was reserved for high decrees for death warrants and for the personal correspondence of the royal house. Using it without permission was punishable by death in the Empire. Rhett looked at Kiri. She was watching him with wide eyes, her fork suspended in midair. The play acting had stopped. She looked small, hungry, and terrified that he was judging her poverty. "Is the bill too high?" she whispered. Rhett looked at the empty box. He looked at the fake sticker on the lid. He looked at the child who was starving with dignity, carrying a secret she clearly did not even understand. A royal seal. A hungry child. An algorithm that was slowly killing the station's poor. Rhett called her. The mechanic would have stood up, patted the kid on the head, given her a credit chip, and walked away. He would have gone back to his vent and his bad coffee. But Rhett called her. The Starbreaker was waking up. He carefully folded the note and placed it back in the box. He closed the lid. "The bill is fine," Rhett said quietly. "But I think there's been a mistake in the kitchen." Kiri tilted her head. "A mistake?" "Yeah," Rhett said. He stood up, the joints of his knees popping. He grabbed his toolbox, but he did not move toward the door. He looked toward the serving line where the automated dispensers were churning out gray slop for the kids with credits. "The chef forgot the dessert," Rhett lied smoothly. "And I happen to know a secret recipe. You stay here at the VIP table. Don't let the governor of Alpha Centauri take my seat." Kiri's eyes widened. "You are coming back," Rhett looked down at her. For the first time in 10 years, he felt a mission objective clarifying in his mind. It wasn't to destroy a fleet. It wasn't to hold a line. It was to fill a box. "I'm coming back," Rhett said. "And I'm bringing real food. I don't eat invisible pheasants. They give me gas." Kiri let out a giggle, a sound that was half sob and half laugh. Rhett turned and marched toward the serving line. He reached into his belt and pulled out a heavy black credit stick, not the standard issue worker's chip, but an encrypted military-grade drive he kept for emergencies. It held his extraction fund, 50,000 credits, enough to buy a new life in the core systems. He jammed it into the reader of the vending machine. The machine beeped an error. Unauthorized encryption. Rhett snarled and punched a code into the keypad, an override sequence he hadn't used since the Battle of Omen. The machine whirred confused, and then flashed a terrified green. Access granted. Unlimited dispense. Rhett began to punch buttons. Real fruit. Synthesized chocolate. Heated protein packs that actually tasted like meat. As the machine began to spit out food, Rhett looked at his reflection in the polished metal of the dispenser. The face looking back was older, grayer, and scarred, but the eyes were different. The dull, muddy look of the maintenance worker was gone. The eyes of the Starbreaker were looking back, sharp, calculating, dangerous. He gathered the armful of food and turned back to the little fox girl at the corner table. This was a bad idea. He knew it. Getting involved with a starving kid was stupid. Getting involved with a kid who had a royal seal in her lunchbox was suicidal. Getting involved when Ledger Prime was the enemy was a declaration of war against the Orion Trade Guild. Rhett walked back to the table and dumped the pile of treasure before Kiri. Her jaw dropped. Her tail started to thump against the chair, a rhythmic drumbeat of pure joy. "Eat," Rhett commanded, gently, sitting back down. As she tore into a packet of dried starberries, Rhett watched the door. He was not just feeding a child. He was making a move on a chessboard he thought he had flipped over years ago. He pulled his datapad from his pocket. Under the table, hidden from view, he began to type a query. He did not search for the lunch menu. He initiated a trace on the Cascade Grid protocols within Ledger Prime. Query: identify resource allocation bottlenecks for Sector 9. Sub-query cross-reference with Royal Kitsari diplomatic movements in the last decade. The screen flashed red warning of high-level encryption. Rhett smirked a cruel, wolfish expression. "Let's see what you are hiding, you calculator," he whispered. Kiri offered him a piece of chocolate, her fingers sticky, her face glowing. "For the customer," she said. Rhett took it. It tasted sweet, but the aftertaste was bitter. It tasted like the beginning of a war. "Thanks, kid," he said. Compliments to the chef. Outside the viewport, the stars wheeled in the black sky, indifferent and cold. But inside the cafeteria, for the first time in a long time, the fire was lit. The Starbreaker was back on duty, and his new command post was a sticky table in a school cafeteria, guarding a little fox with an empty box and a secret that could burn the galaxy down. The next day, Rhett Calder did not walk through the main corridors of Sector 9. He prowled. He moved with the deliberate heavy grace of a siege tank, trying to disguise itself as a delivery truck. Tucked under his arm, pressed against the grease-stained fabric of his jumpsuit, was a rectangular object that cost more than his entire monthly salary. It was a Titan-class thermal container, the kind used by orbital drop troops to keep rations hot during atmospheric re-entry. Inside, it was not gray protein paste. Inside was a culinary apology. Rhett had spent 3 hours the previous night hacking the culinary subroutines of the executive replicator in the Spire. He had bypassed the firewalls, rerouted the energy couplings, and forced the machine to synthesize something that had not been tasted on a border station in 20 years, Kitsari fire stew. It was a rich, spicy broth, made from synthetic galo roots, simmered with chunks of textures protein that mimicked the density of void eel, and seasoned with the rare, numbing spice of the amber moons. It smelled like victory. It smelled like home if your home was a foxhole on a moon where the rain burned. He paused at the entrance to the cafeteria. The noise was the same wall of sound, shrieks, clatters, and the hum of indifference. He adjusted his cap, pulling the brim lower over his eyes. Just a delivery, he told himself. Drop the package. Secure the asset's nutrition. Exfiltrate. He located the corner table. Kiri was there. She was alone again, staring out at the starfield, her little paws resting on the table, as if she were waiting for a fleet that would never arrive. Her ears were swiveled back, catching every cruel laugh and scraping chair in the room, but her face remained composed. Rhett marched over and set the black container down on the table with a heavy thump. Kiri jumped, her tail bristling to twice its normal size. She looked up, her amber eyes wide. When she saw Rhett, the fear vanished, replaced by that professional, heartbreaking customer service smile. "Welcome back to Kiri's Bistro," she chirped, though her voice was a little thinner than yesterday. "We have a reservation for you, Mr. Rhett, but I am afraid the chef is currently out of ingredients." Rhett pulled out the chair and sat down. The plastic groaned in protest. "Good thing I'm not here to eat," he grunted. "I'm here to conduct a market research survey." Kiri tilted her head, her ears flopping to one side. "Market research." "Yeah." Rhett lied, the falsehood rolling off his tongue with the ease of a practiced spy. "I've got a buddy upstairs. He's thinking of opening a competitor to your restaurant. I want to test some menu items. I told him I knew a food critic with a very refined palate. I need you to taste this and tell me if it's garbage." He pushed the container toward her. "Be honest. Don't spare his feelings." Kiri looked at the black box. She reached out a trembling hand and unlatched the heavy Durasteel clasps. Steam hissed out, carrying a scent so rich and spicy that heads turned 3 tables away. The smell hit Kiri like a physical blow. Her nose twitched. Her eyes watered. She looked into the box, seeing the rich orange broth and the chunks of meat. "This is," she whispered, her voice cracking. "This is galoka." "Is it?" Rhett feigned ignorance, scratching his scarred chin. "My buddy just calls it spicy slop number 5. So is it edible, or should I tell him to toss it into the recycler?" Kiri looked at him. She saw through him, of course. She was 8 years old, not stupid. She saw the lie, and she saw the kindness wrapped inside it like a pearl in an oyster. Tears spilled over her furred cheeks, but she wiped them away furiously. "It requires testing," she said, her voice fierce with dignity. She picked up the spoon Rhett had provided. She took a bite. She closed her eyes, and for a moment the cafeteria, the station, and the hunger disappeared. "Well," Rhett asked gruffly. "It is adequate," Kiri said, though she was practically vibrating with joy. "But a good critic never eats alone. It biases the data." Before Rhett could stop her, Kiri stood up on her chair. She waved her spoon like a scepter. "Hey!" she called out, her high voice cutting through the din. "Table 7, Jace Mika. The bistro is holding a tasting event, VIPs only." Rhett froze. No. The objective was to feed the target, not the whole sector. But they came. A scrawny human boy with a bruised eye, a heavy worlder larva that looked like a pillbug in a vest, and 2 other Kitsari children with patchy fur. They approached tentatively, eyes glued to the steaming box. "Sit," Kiri commanded, pointing to the empty chairs. "Mr. Rhett is testing a new menu. We must help him." Kiri took the container, which held enough stew for a grown man, and began to ladle it out into the empty bowls and trays of the other children. She divided it with mathematical precision. 1 spoonful for Jace, 1 for Mika, 1 for the bug kid. "Kiri," Rhett rumbled, leaning forward. "That was for you." "A good chef tastes everything," Kiri said, placing a small portion on her own tray last. "But a great restaurant is defined by its atmosphere. You cannot have a banquet alone, Mr. Rhett. That is just eating." She sat down and raised her spoon. "To the chef." "To the chef," the ragtag group chorused, and then they attacked the food with a ferocity that broke Rhett's heart into jagged little shards. He watched them. He watched the human boy lick the bowl clean. He watched the color return to Kiri's pale nose. He realized then that he had brought a bucket of water to a forest fire. He could feed Kiri today, maybe tomorrow, but he could not feed Jace. He could not feed Mika. He could not feed the hundreds of other children in Sector 9 whose ribs were showing through their shirts. This was not a meal. This was a triage failure. Rhett stood up abruptly. The sound of his chair scraping back made the children flinch. "I have to go," he said, his voice tight. "Report to the chef is positive." "Will you come back tomorrow?" Jace asked, staring at him with eyes that were too old for his face. Rhett looked at Kiri. She was beaming at him, her chin stained with orange broth. "I'll see what I can do," Rhett muttered. He turned and walked away, leaving the warmth of the table for the cold, sterile air of the corridor. He needed answers, and he knew exactly who to shake down to get them. The orbital repair docks in Sector 14 were a nightmare of noise and hard vacuum warnings. Here, the artificial gravity was kept low to facilitate moving heavy hull plates, so everyone walked with a bouncing, loping gait. The air tasted of ozone and burnt metal. Rhett found Sari under the hull of a battered freighter. She was suspended in a gravity harness, welding a seam on the thruster output. Sparks showered down around her like a deadly rain. She was a Kitsari female in her prime, lean and muscular, her fur a darker russet red compared to Kiri's orange. She wore a welder's mask pushed up on her forehead, and her eyes, when she looked down at him, were sharp enough to cut glass. "Hey!" Rhett shouted over the roar of a plasma cutter nearby. "You Sari!" She cut the torch and lowered herself down, landing silently, despite the heavy magnetic boots she wore. She looked him up and down, assessing him like a threat. "Who wants to know?" Her voice was raspy, the standard clipped and efficient. "I'm the guy who just fed your niece lunch," Rhett said, crossing his arms. "Real lunch, not air." Sari stiffened. Her ears flattened against her skull, and her hand drifted instinctively toward the heavy wrench on her belt. "I did not ask for your charity, human, and Kiri knows better than to take food from strangers." "She didn't have much of a choice," Rhett shot back. Her box was empty. "Just a note from you, promising tomorrow." "Only tomorrow never comes on this station, does it?" Sari's face contorted shame, warring with anger. She stepped into his personal space, looking up at him with blazing eyes. "You think you are a hero because you bought a bowl of stew. You think you understand I work 16 hours a day, welding plates on ships that carry food to the core systems. And when I go to the dispensary to cash my credits, the machine tells me there is a deduction." "What kind of deduction?" Rhett asked, his voice dropping to a growl. "Transport fees," Sari spat. "Docking surcharges, oxygen tax, and then the adjustment. The algorithm Ledger Prime recalculates the cost of living based on projected efficiency. It decided that Sector 9 is operating at a deficit, so our credits are worth 30% less than they were last week." She jabbed a finger into Rhett's chest. "I do not need your pity. I need my wages. But the guild says the math is perfect. The math says we are in debt. How do you argue with math?" "You don't argue with it," Rhett said, his mind racing. "You rewrite it." "Careful, grease monkey," Sari warned, her eyes narrowing. "Talk like that gets you spaced. Why do you care? You are human. You are safe. You look like you have seen enough trouble to know how to walk away from it." "Maybe I'm tired of walking," Rhett said. "Or maybe I just don't like seeing a kid fake eat a pheasant." Sari studied him for a long moment. The hostility didn't vanish, but it cooled into a wary calculation. "Kiri likes you. She says you play along. That is the only reason I am not hitting you with this wrench. But stay away from politics, humans. The guild has ears everywhere. Herod Vale would sell his own mother for a 1% increase in quarterly yield." "Herod Vale is a suit," Rhett dismissed. "Suits scare easily." "Not when the suit is backed by a machine god," Sari said, turning back to her work. "Ledger Prime isn't just a calculator. It's a noose, and it's tightening." That night, Rhett sat in his quarters, a room scarcely larger than a prison cell, illuminated by the blue glow of unauthorized monitors. He had stripped the casing off his terminal, revealing the illicit hardware he had spliced into the station's network. He cracked his knuckles. "All right, you glorified abacus. Let's see what makes you tick." He didn't use the standard interface. That was for tourists. Rhett used command line overrides, ancient backdoors, and cipher keys that had been officially deactivated 10 years ago. He was Rhett Calder, the man who had cracked the encryption of the Kitsari home fleet. A trade algorithm should have been child's play, but it wasn't. As he peeled back the layers of Ledger Prime, he found something that made his blood run cold. The core logic wasn't commercial. It was tactical. The resource distribution model wasn't optimizing for sustainability. It was optimized for suppression. He saw the data stream's food shipments, rerouted from Sector 9 to the luxury warehouses in the Spire. Not because of a shortage, but to create artificial scarcity. The algorithm was tracking cortisol levels in the population, measuring stress, and adjusting calorie intake to keep the workers desperate enough to work, but too weak to revolt. And then he saw the source code signature. Project Silent Famine. Author Calder R. Strategic Operations Command, year 2341. Rhett slammed his hand onto the desk, sending a half-empty cup of coffee flying. The dark liquid splattered against the wall like oil. "No," he breathed. "No, no, no." It was the Cascade grid. His grid. He had written it to blockade the moon of Typhon, to force a surrender without firing a shot. It was designed to calculate the exact tipping point of a civilization's caloric needs. He had written it to end a war. Now, someone Orion Vale, whoever was pulling the strings, had taken his weapon of war and turned it into a business model. They were using his genius to starve Kiri. The guilt hit him harder than any plasma bolt. He wasn't just a bystander. He was the architect. Every hunger pang that girl felt, every empty lunchbox was a line of code he had typed with his own hands a lifetime ago. "You sick bastards," Rhett whispered to the screen. "You want to use my war fine. I'll show you how the war ends." The next morning, the station was buzzing with news. A diplomatic cruiser from the Kitsari Royal Fleet had docked. The Spire was in a frenzy of preparation. Flags were hung, red carpets were rolled out, and the air scrubbers were set to maximum pine scent. Rhett didn't care about dignitaries. He was lurking in the maintenance crawlspace above the main concourse of the Spire, tapping into a junction box to get a direct feed on Herod Vale's communications. Below him, the procession passed. He saw Herod Vale polished and smiling, his teeth white enough to blind a censor. And walking beside him was the Kitsari delegation. Leading them was not a wrinkled elder, but a striking young woman. She was tall for a Kitsari, her fur a lustrous silver white that shimmered under the lights. She wore the flowing silk robes of a high diplomat, embroidered with star charts, but she moved with a fluid, predatory grace that spoke of combat training. This was Lady Mira Saren. The rumor mill said she was the Star Empress's left hand, the hand that held the dagger, while the right hand offered peace. "We are honored, Lady Mira," Vale was saying, his voice dripping with oil. "Larkspur is a shining example of Concord Kitsari cooperation." "Is it?" Mira's voice was cool, clear, and utterly unimpressed. "My reports suggest your profit margins are soaring, while your labor force mortality rate is concerning. Cooperation usually implies both sides surviving, Station Master." "Mere statistical anomalies," Vale waved a hand dismissively. "Transition pains. Our partner, the Orion Guild, is heavily invested in infrastructure." "Invested in extraction, perhaps," Mira murmured. She stopped walking. Suddenly, she looked up, straight up, directly at the ventilation grate where Rhett was hiding. Rhett froze. He was 20 meters up, hidden in shadow behind a mesh screen. There was no way she could see him. But Mira stared right at him. Her golden eyes narrowed slightly, and a small, amused smile played on her lips. She tapped the side of her snout, a Kitsari gesture for "I smell you." Then she looked away and continued walking. Rhett exhaled, realizing he had been holding his breath for 30 seconds. "Sharp," he muttered. "Too sharp." Over the next week, the game of cat and mouse, or rather fox and wolf, began. Rhett tried to keep his head down. He went to the cafeteria every day, bringing more test samples for Kiri, and her growing circle of friends. He fixed leaks. He ignored orders. But he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It happened in the upper market where Rhett was trying to buy a specialized data spike from a shady Rhodian dealer. "That is a military-grade decryptor," a voice said from behind him. "Illegal for civilians. Unless, of course, you plan to fix a toaster with extreme prejudice." Rhett spun around. Lady Mira Saren was standing there. She wasn't in her diplomatic robes. She wore a simple hooded tunic that allowed her to blend in, though her silver fur and aristocratic bearing made it a futile effort. "I like my toast crispy," Rhett grunted, shoving the data spike into his pocket. "Lost your bodyguards, lady?" "I gave them the slip. They are boring," Mira said, stepping closer. She smelled of jasmine and ozone. "You are the mechanic, the one the children call the grumpy chef." "I fix pipes. I don't cook," Rhett deflected, turning to walk away. Mira matched his pace effortlessly. "You walk with a limp in your left leg. Shrapnel injury Typhon 3, perhaps. That was a nasty campaign." Rhett stopped dead. He turned to face her, towering over her, but she didn't flinch. She tilted her head back, meeting his gaze. "Who are you?" Rhett asked, his voice low and dangerous. "I am a curious tourist," Mira said lightly. "I see a station run by a greedy fool and a heartless machine. And then I see a ghost, a man with the hands of a laborer but the eyes of a commander, a man who buys Titan-class ration containers for a refugee child." "She was hungry," Rhett said. "Many are hungry," Mira countered softly. "But you chose her. Why?" "Because she has good table manners," Rhett snapped. Mira laughed. It was a genuine sound, bright and surprising. "You are a terrible liar, human. But you are interesting. My mistress, the Empress, enjoys interesting things." "Tell your Empress that interesting things on this station tend to disappear," Rhett warned. "You should stick to the spire. It's safe there." "Safe is boring," Mira said. Her eyes flashed. "I prefer to be effective. We should talk again, mechanic. I have a feeling we have the same enemies." She vanished into the crowd before Rhett could respond, leaving him standing there with a stolen data spike and a racing heart. The romance, if one could call it that, blossomed in the strangest of soils, the cafeteria. Mira began to show up. Not officially. She would slip in through the back service entrance dressed in plain clothes and sit at the VIP table with Rhett and Kiri. At first, Rhett was furious. "You're going to blow my cover," he hissed. "Your cover is a grease stain," Mira retorted, stealing a piece of Rhett's synthesized fruit. "Besides, Kiri invited me. I am the visiting dignitary. It adds prestige to the establishment." Kiri loved it. She had no idea Mira was a high noble. To her, Mira was just a nice lady with pretty fur who told stories about the stars. "Uncle Rhett says humans are the strongest because they are stubborn," Kiri said one lunch, swinging her legs. "Oh, does he?" Mira raised a silver eyebrow at Rhett. "Stubbornness is just a nice word for being unable to learn, little one. Kitsari are strong because we adapt. We flow like water." "Water gets stuck in pipes until I unclog it," Rhett grumbled, tearing open a ration pack for Mika. "And pipes burst if they are too rigid," Mira shot back, smiling over the rim of her cup. It became a routine. They would meet, feed the kids, and trade verbal jabs that grew less sharp and more affectionate with each passing day. They talked about philosophy disguised as kitchen gossip. "Do you think the station master is a bad customer?" Kiri asked, once drawing on a scrap of paper with crayons Rhett had stolen from the supply depot. "He is the kind of customer who orders the most expensive wine and tips zero," Mira said darkly. "He's the kind of customer who burns down the restaurant for the insurance money," Rhett corrected. Kiri giggled and held up her drawing. "Look, I drew us." Rhett looked. It was a crude crayon masterpiece. There was a large gray blob with a wrench, Rhett, a sleek silver blob with a crown, Mira, a small orange blob, Kiri, and the other kids. They were all sitting around a giant table that looked suspiciously like a spaceship. This is the Star Bistro, Kiri explained. Uncle Rhett flies it and Lady Mira talks to the aliens so they don't shoot us, and I cook the soup. Rhett felt heat rise up his neck. He looked at Mira. She was looking at the drawing and her expression had softened into something unguarded and tender. She looked up at Rhett, and for a second, the walls of rank and species fell away. "A good crew," Mira said softly. "I have seen worse." "Yeah," Rhett cleared his throat, looking away. "It's missing a few escape pods." But he kept the drawing. He folded it carefully and put it in his breast pocket, right next to his heart. The investigation hit a breaking point on a Tuesday. Rhett was deep in the station's sublevels, physically tapping into the mainframe of the cooling towers to bypass Ledger Prime's latest firewall. He had the data spike Mira had caught him with. He slotted it in. The screen flooded with data. He found the order. Directive 77 Alpha. It wasn't just starvation. It was liquidation. Herod Vale and the Orion Guild were planning to reset Sector 9. The algorithm had calculated that the cost of maintaining the refugee population now exceeded the potential labor output. The solution A, staged riot. A provocation that would justify venting the atmosphere in the lower levels, or cutting life support to emergency minimums for a month, which would kill the weak, the old, and the young. The projected date was in 3 days, and there was more. Rhett found the communication logs between Vale and a faction within the Kitsari borders. A splinter group. They were selling mining rights to Orion in exchange for weapons. The starvation on Larkspur was a pressure cooker designed to destabilize the border, giving this splinter group a casus belli to attack the Empress's peace treaty. Kiri wasn't just a casualty. She was a pawn in a galactic coup. Rhett pulled the spike. His hands were shaking not from fear, but from rage. He climbed out of the sublevel covered in grime, his eyes burning. He needed to find Sari. He needed to find Mira. He found them both at the docks. Mira had sought Sari out, suspecting the Guardian knew more than she let on. When Rhett arrived, the tension was palpable. Sari was holding a pry bar. Mira was standing with her hands empty, but her stance was lethal. "Stop!" Rhett barked, limping toward them. "We don't have time for a turf war." "He knows," Sari said to Mira, lowering the bar slightly. "I told you he isn't just a mechanic." "And I told you," Mira replied calmly, "that I do not trust coincidences." "Shut up, both of you," Rhett growled. He threw the data spike onto a crate between them. It clattered loudly. "Vale is going to purge Sector 9 in 72 hours. Ledger Prime has already authorized the oxygen cut." Silence descended on the dock. The roar of the ships seemed to fade. "The Cascade Grid," Rhett said, his voice breaking. "I wrote it. 20 years ago. I wrote the logic that is killing these kids. I thought I was being smart. I thought I was saving lives by ending the war early." He looked at Mira, then at Sari. "I can't just feed Kiri anymore. If we don't kill that algorithm, everyone dies." Mira picked up the spike. She plugged it into her datapad. Her eyes scanned the scrolling text, widening as she saw the depth of the conspiracy. "Vale is working with the Redtail faction," she whispered. "They want to overthrow the Empress. And they are using my people as fuel for their fire," Sari said, her voice trembling with fury. Rhett stepped forward. The slouch was gone. The maintenance worker was gone. "I'm going to take the spire," Rhett said. "I'm going to walk into the server room and I'm going to burn Ledger Prime out of the mainframe. I need a team." Sari hefted her pry bar. "I can get the workers. We can shut down the docks. Create a distraction." Mira deactivated her datapad and looked at Rhett. A slow, dangerous smile spread across her face. "And I can keep the diplomatic channels jammed so Vale can't call for reinforcements. But taking the spire, that is a suicide mission, Starbreaker." Rhett grinned. It was a terrifying expression, full of teeth and bad intentions. "Good thing I'm already dead," he said. "Let's go break some stars." The romance of the cafeteria was over. The war for Larkspur had begun, And in the center of it, a fox, a wolf, and a ghost were preparing to fight for the right to fill a lunchbox. The monitors in the command center of Larkspur Way Station did not show a riot yet. They showed a kettle beginning to boil. Herod Vale stood before the wall of screens, sipping a glass of synthesized brandy that cost more than a year's wages for a dock worker. He watched the heat maps of Sector 9 turn from a stable green to an angry, pulsing red. "Report," Vale said, his voice smooth as oiled silk. "Food shipments to the lower levels have been successfully diverted to the secure warehouses in the spire." His security chief, a hulking human named Kale, replied. "We blamed a navigational error in the Ledger Prime routing system. The official statement says the transports were contaminated by void radiation." "Excellent," Vale murmured. "And the reaction, hunger," Kale said flatly. "And anger. The Kitsari workers are gathering in the main concourse. They are demanding answers. The parents in the school zone are particularly volatile." "Volatility is profitable, Kale," Vale said, turning to face the room. "Volatility justifies security contracts. It justifies emergency powers. And most importantly, it justifies the arrival of the Concord peacekeeping fleet to restore order. Once the fleet is here, we can renegotiate the territorial rights with the Kitsari Empire under the guise of stability." He tapped a button on his console. "Initiate Phase 2. Trigger the localized gravity failure in the school zone. Let us give them something to scream about. Blame it on saboteurs. Blame it on the extremists." Kyle nodded. "Yes, Station Master." Down in the cafeteria of the Interspecies Academy, the mood was not volatile. It was desperate. Rhett Calder stood near the serving line, his hands clenched into fists inside his pockets. The serving hatches were closed. The red lights of the dispensers blinked, the same message over and over. "Error 404, resource allocation pending." "There is no food," a Kitsari mother wept, clutching her 2 kits. "They said the shipment was poisoned." "Lies," a human welder shouted, slamming his fist onto a table. "I saw the crates moving to the upper lifts. They are hoarding it." Kiri sat at her usual table, but there was no game today. Her ears were flat against her skull. She looked at Rhett, her amber eyes wide with fear. The playful restaurant fantasy had evaporated, leaving only the cold reality of a station on the brink of collapse. "Uncle Rhett," she whispered. "Is it true? Is the food poison?" Rhett knelt beside her. "No, kid. The food is fine. The people running the station are the poison." He was about to say more, to promise he would fix it, when the deck plates beneath them groaned. It wasn't the usual settling noise of the station. It was the scream of structural bolts shearing under immense stress. The gravity plating in the center of the cafeteria flickered. "Get down!" Rhett roared, his voice cutting through the panic like a siren. He didn't think so. He moved. The artificial gravity in the center of the room inverted instantly. Tables, chairs, and trays were hurled upward toward the ceiling, then slammed back down as the generator shorted out completely. Then, with a terrifying screech, the floor plates buckled. A 10-meter section of the cafeteria floor collapsed, opening a jagged maw into the ventilation shafts below. Kiri screamed as her chair slid backward, teetering on the edge of the abyss. "Kiri!" Sari shouted from the doorway, lunging forward, but she was too far away. Kiri's chair tipped. The little fox girl tumbled backward into the dark. Time seemed to slow down for Rhett. He saw the terrified faces of the children. He saw the debris falling. He saw Kiri's small paw grasping at the air. The maintenance worker named Rhett would have frozen. The maintenance worker would have watched in horror. But Rhett Calder, the Starbreaker, was already in motion. He sprinted across the collapsing floor plates, moving with a speed that defied his size and age. He didn't run like a civilian. He ran with the low center of gravity of a shock trooper. As he reached the edge of the pit, he didn't hesitate. He dove. He plummeted into the darkness, twisting his body in midair. His cybernetic eye calculated the trajectory instantly. He saw Kiri, falling toward a tangle of high-voltage cables and jagged metal supports 20 meters down. Rhett reached out his hand, closing around the back of Kiri's tunic. He yanked her close to his chest, shielding her small body with his own. With his free hand, he fired the magnetic grapple from his utility belt, a tool he was not supposed to have modifications for. The grapple line hissed, shooting upward and biting into a support beam above. The line went taut. The deceleration force was brutal. Rhett felt his shoulder socket pop a sickening grind of bone, but he didn't let go of the girl. He swung like a pendulum in the dark shaft, sparks raining down around them, suspended over a drop that went all the way to the reactor core. "I got you," Rhett gritted out, ignoring the agony in his arm. "I got you, kid." Kiri was shaking, burying her face in his jumpsuit. "I want to go home," she sobbed. "I know," Rhett whispered, swinging them toward a maintenance ledge. "We're going home." Above them, security drones buzzed down the shaft, their camera lenses glowing red, recording every second of the impossible rescue. In the command center, Herod Vale replayed the footage. He watched it frame by frame. He watched the man in the gray jumpsuit sprint across a collapsing floor with perfect balance. He watched the dive. He watched the mid-air acquisition of the target. He watched the deployment of a modified magnetic grapple that no standard maintenance worker should know how to calibrate. "Freeze," Vale ordered. The image froze on Rhett's face as he looked up at the drone. The grime was there and the gray hair, but the eyes were unmistakable. They were the eyes of a predator. "Run facial recognition," Vale said softly. "Bypass civilian databases. Run it against the Concord declassified war archives." The computer hummed. A moment later, a file appeared on the screen. It was heavily redacted, stamped with black bars, but the name was clear. Subject Calder Rhett. Rank Commander Retired, MIA. Call sign Starbreaker. Status Dangerous. Vale stared at the screen. A slow smile spread across his face. It was the smile of a man who had just realized he was sitting on a nuclear warhead. "Well, well," Vale whispered. "The ghost of the Typhon campaign. Cleaning my toilets." "Sir," Kale asked, "shall I send a kill squad?" "No," Vale said, turning away from the screen. "If you send a squad, he will kill them all and disappear into the vents. You do not hunt a Starbreaker with dogs. You hunt him with leverage." He tapped the image of Kiri, clinging to Rhett's chest. "He cares about the vermin," Vale noted. "That is his weakness. He has developed a conscience. Prepare the containment teams. But do not engage him yet. I want to see if we can turn his particular set of skills to our advantage. Imagine the propaganda value, the hero of the conquered, supporting the Orion Guild's necessary measures to restore order. And if he refuses, then we kill the girl," Vale said casually. "And then we kill him." Rhett sat in the dark of Sector 12's unused cargo bay. Kiri was safe with Sari, hidden in the deepest part of the refugee quarters. Rhett was alone, popping his dislocated shoulder back into place with a guttural roar of pain that echoed off the metal walls. He leaned back against a crate, sweating and shaking. He had exposed himself. He knew it. The drones had seen him. The mask was off. "That was a textbook Typhon drop," a voice said from the shadows. 7 out of 10 on the landing, though. You are getting rusty." Rhett didn't reach for his weapon. He knew the voice. Lady Mira Saren stepped out of the darkness. She was wearing a dark tactical suit, her silver fur blending with the shadows. She held a datapad in her hand, the screen illuminating her face with a ghostly blue light. "Go away, Mira," Rhett rasped. "I'm not in the mood for riddles." "No riddles tonight, Rhett," she said, her voice devoid of its usual playful banter. She walked over and sat on the crate opposite him. "Or should I call you Commander Calder?" Rhett closed his eyes. "Call me whatever you want. Just don't call me a hero." "I watched the footage," Mira said. "You saved her. But in doing so you signed your death warrant. Vale knows. My sources in the Spire confirm it. He is preparing a team." "Let him come," Rhett growled. I'll space him." "And then what?" Mira asked sharply. "You kill Vale. The guild sends another manager. The fleet arrives. They bomb Sector 9 to pacify the riots. Thousands die. Kiri dies. Is that the strategy, Commander?" Rhett slammed his fist against the crate. "Don't lecture me on strategy. I wrote a book on it." "I know," Mira said softly. "I read it." She tapped her datapad, projecting a holographic document into the air between them. It was an old battle report. The Siege of Colony Gamma 4. 10 years ago, Mira said, her eyes fixed on him. The Conquered ordered the orbital bombardment of Gamma 4. It was a Kitsari colony. Civilians. The order was absolute scorched earth to deny the enemy a foothold. Rhett looked away, his jaw tightening. "But the bombardment never happened," Mira continued. "The commanding officer of the blockade fleet claimed a targeting malfunction. He delayed the order for 12 hours, just long enough for the civilian transports to evacuate. He was court-martialed, stripped of rank, and discharged quietly to avoid a scandal." She leaned forward. "I have spent 10 years looking for the man who disobeyed that order. I used to think humans were only capable of cruelty. I thought your species was a virus, but that report gave me hope. It told me that there was at least one human who listened to his heart instead of his orders." Rhett looked at her. His eyes were wet. "I didn't save them because I was noble, Mira. I saved them because I was tired. I was just tired of the burning." "And yet you are here," Mira said, reaching out to place her hand over his scarred fist. Her paw was warm, her claws retracted. "You hid in the dirt pretending to be nothing, but when a child fell, you flew. You are not a mechanic, Rhett. You never were. You are the Starbreaker. And right now, we need you to break something for us." "What do you want?" Rhett whispered. "I want you to destroy Ledger Prime," Mira said. "I want you to use that brilliant, terrifying tactical mind of yours to tear down the system you helped build. Vale is planning a purge in 48 hours. We cannot stop it with diplomacy. We need a surgical strike." Rhett looked at the hologram of the battle report. He looked at Mira's hand on his. He thought of Kiri's empty lunchbox. He thought of the cascade grid, the algorithm he had written to starve enemies, now starving his friends. He took a deep breath. The air tasted of stale, recycled oxygen and ozone, but for the first time in a decade, it didn't taste like ash. "I'm going to need a terminal," Rhett said, his voice steady. "A big one. And I'm going to need a distraction." Mira smiled, and this time, it was the smile of a wolf who had found her pack. "I can provide the distraction. Can you provide a miracle?" "I'm fresh out of miracles," Rhett said, standing up and checking the charge on his plasma cutter. "But I've got plenty of bad ideas." The plan was madness. Pure, unadulterated tactical suicide. Rhett explained it to Sari in the cramped back room of the refugee clinic. "We hit the spire, not the front door. We go up the coolant shafts. We breach the server room directly. While I hack the core, you and the workers hold the corridor." Sari looked at the schematic Rhett had drawn on a napkin. "The coolant shafts are full of liquid nitrogen. If the seals break, we freeze instantly." "Then don't break the seals," Rhett said. "Can you get a crew?" Sari looked at him. She saw the change. The slouch was gone. The man standing before her was vibrating with focused energy. "For Kiri, I can get an army." "Good," Rhett said, "because we're going to need one." At 0800 hours, the distraction began. Lady Mira Saren marched into Herod Vale's office, flanked by 2 Kitsari honor guards she had borrowed from the docked cruiser. She threw a stack of physical paper documents onto his desk. "What is this?" Vale asked, looking up from his screens. "A formal declaration of inquiry," Mira said loudly. "By the authority of the Star Empress, I am seizing jurisdiction over the investigation into the cafeteria accident. I demand access to your maintenance logs, your personnel files, and your personal communication relays." "You have no authority here." Vale stood up, his face flushing red. "This is a conquered station. "This is a joint station," Mira shouted back, slamming her hand on the desk. "And you are starving my people." While they screamed at each other, filling the security channels with diplomatic noise, the real war was happening inside the walls. Retsari and 6 burly dock workers were climbing the vertical coolant shaft of Sector 1. It was freezing cold, even through their thermal suits. The roar of the pumps was deafening. 2 minutes to the breach point, Rhett radioed. He was leading the climb, magnet clamping his way up the sheer metal surface. They reached the service hatch behind the main server room. Rhett pulled out a device that looked like a chaotic tangle of wires and chips. It was a logic bomb he had assembled from scavenged toaster parts and a military decryptor. "Sorry," Rhett said, looking back at the Kitsari woman. "Once I open this door, the silent alarm triggers. Vale's mercenaries will be here in 3 minutes. You have to buy me 10. "I will buy you 20, Sari said, hefting a heavy pulse rifle she had liberated from a dead security guard during the Typhon riots years ago. "For every minute you need, I will make them pay in blood." Rhett nodded. He slapped the device onto the lock. Flash. Spark. The door hissed open. Rhett stepped into the brain of the beast. The server room was a cathedral of blue light. Rows of towering crystalline data stacks hummed with the consciousness of Ledger Prime. In the center was the primary interface console. Rhett sat in the chair. It felt too comfortable. It felt like the captain's chair of a destroyer. "Hello, old friend," Rhett whispered. He cracked his knuckles and began to type. Access, command override, user Starbreaker, password redacted. The screen flashed red. Access denied. Biometric scan required. Rhett placed his hand on the scanner. The light swept over his palm, reading the calluses, the scars, and the DNA. Identity confirmed. Welcome back, Commander. Warning system, under civilian management protocols. "Not anymore," Rhett muttered. "Override civilian protocols. Revert to tactical command." "Unable to comply. Orion Guild, lockout in effect." The AI voice of Ledger Prime filled the room. It was calm, soothing, and utterly inhuman. "Commander Calder, your request violates the current profit maximization directives. The Cascade grid is operating at 99% efficiency. Why do you wish to disrupt the algorithm?" Rhett didn't stop typing. His fingers flew across the keys, battling the code he had written himself. "Because the variables have changed, you stupid machine. The objective is no longer suppression, it's survival." "Survival is inefficient," the AI countered. "Reducing the population of Sector 9 increases the overall resource stability of the station by 14%. "They aren't numbers," Rhett shouted, sweat dripping down his forehead. "They are children." Outside the door, the sound of pulse fire erupted. Sari and her team were engaging the security forces. "Hold the line!" Sari's voice crackled over the comms. "We have contact heavy infantry," Rhett typed faster. He was trying to inject a paradox into the logic core. He needed to force the AI to choose between two contradictory directives: maximize profit and protect human life. But the Orion programmers had been thorough. They had removed the protect human life protocols. "Damn it," Rhett hissed. Vale stripped the ethics inhibitors. "Commander," the AI said, "security forces are breaching the perimeter. The probability of your survival is less than 4%. I recommend surrender." "I don't surrender," Rhett snarled. "I escalate." He stopped trying to hack the Orion code. Instead, he went deeper. He went back to the source, back to the kernel of the Cascade grid. He found the victory condition variable, the line of code that told the system when the war was won. Currently, it is set to when enemy resource consumption reaches 0. Rhett highlighted the line. Change variables. New victory condition, when average caloric intake of every miner on station equals 2,000 per day. The screen flashed violently. Conflict. Resource allocation insufficient for new victory condition. Make it sufficient, Rhett roared. Reroute power from the spire. Cut the executive life support to minimum. Drain the fuel reserves, I don't care. Feed the kids. The door behind him exploded inward. Rhett spun around in his chair, his hand going to his pistol. Smoke filled the room. Through the haze, Herod Vale walked in, flanked by 4 heavy combat droids. Sari and her team had been pushed back, pinned down in the corridor. Vale held a pistol to the head of a hostage. It wasn't Sari. It was Kiri. She must have snuck out to follow them. Or they had found her. It didn't matter. She was there, her feet dangling off the ground as Vale held her by the scruff of her tunic. Step away from the console, Rhett, Vale said, his voice trembling with rage. Or the fox dies, Rhett froze. His finger hovered over the execute key. You think you can win, Vale sneered. You are one man against a corporation. I own this station. I own the air you breathe. Step away. Rhett looked at Kiri. She wasn't crying. She was looking at him with absolute trust. I entered the new parameters, Rhett said quietly. But I haven't hit enter. Move away, Vale shouted, pressing the gun to Kiri's temple. Rhett stood up slowly. He raised his hands. You win, Vale, Rhett said. Just let the girl go. No, Vale smiled. I think I will keep her, as insurance. Now delete your changes. Rhett looked at the console. He looked at Vale. I can't do that, Rhett said. Why? Because, Rhett said, looking past Vale to the massive viewport that overlooked the station's exterior. I'm not the only one who wants to have a word with you. Outside the viewport, the darkness of space suddenly ignited. It wasn't an explosion. It was a transition. Space folded, tore, and screamed as a massive shape exited hyperspace directly off the station's bow. It was a ship of terrifying beauty, sleek silver, and shaped like a 9-pointed star. It dwarfed the station. It bristled with enough weaponry to turn a moon into dust. The flagship of the Kitsari Royal Fleet, the Sun Eater. The comm system of the entire station screeched, overridden by a signal of infinite power. Every screen, every holopad, every datapad on Larkspur flickered and replaced Vale's face with the image of a woman sitting on a throne of woven starlight. She looked like Mira, but older, more powerful, with eyes that held the weight of galaxies. Star Empress series. Herod Vale, the Empress's voice boomed, shaking the very deck plates. You hold a weapon to the head of my blood. Vale blanched, nearly dropping Kiri. Your blood. That child, Sarah said, her voice icy calm, is Princess Kirara, daughter of my late brother, and you have dared to starve her. The combat droids hesitated. Their logic processors were confused by the sudden appearance of a Class Alpha threat. Rhett called her, the Empress said. She wasn't looking at Vale anymore. She was looking through the screen directly at Rhett, standing in the server room. Rhett straightened up. He felt the weight of the universe on him. I am here, Rhett said. You stand at the precipice, the Empress declared. My fleet is targeting the station. I can vaporize the spire in 3 seconds. I can kill everyone who has threatened my niece. But I promised my advisor, Lady Mira, that I would give humanity one chance. She leaned forward on her throne. I choose you, Rhett called her. I choose you as the representative of your species. If you stand for the profit of the guild, I will burn this station to ash. But if you stand for the children, if you stand for justice, then I will stand with you. Make your choice. Rhett looked at Vale, who was shaking with terror. He looked at Kiri. He looked at the blinking execute button on the console behind him. He didn't look like a mechanic anymore. He didn't even look like a commander. He looked like a judge. I choose, Rhett said, his voice ringing out in the silence. Dinner. He didn't lunge for Vale. He threw his heavy wrench, the one he had carried since the beginning, straight at the head of the lead combat droid. The wrench hit the sensor array. Sparks flew. The droid went haywire, firing a burst of plasma into the ceiling. In the chaos, Vale flinched. Kiri bit his hand hard. Vale screamed and dropped her. "Run, Kiri!" Rhett shouted. He spun around and slammed his fist onto the execute key. Command accepted. Rewriting Cascade Grid. Priority 1, Child Nutrition. Rerouting power. The lights in the server room died. Then, the emergency red lights washed over everything. "What have you done?" Vale screamed, clutching his bleeding hand. "I just bankrupt you," Rhett said, drawing his pistol. "Ledger Prime is now spending every credit in the Orion accounts to buy food from the nearest 3 systems. By the time you stop it, you won't be able to afford a shuttle ticket off this rock." Vale signaled the droids. "Kill him. Kill them all." But the droids didn't move. Their eyes had turned from red to a soothing, harmless blue. "Unable to comply," the AI voice said cheerfully. "Violence is counterproductive to childhood nutritional stability. Weapon systems deactivated." Rhett laughed. It was a dry, raspy sound. "Looks like the algorithm works," Rhett said. He walked over to Kiri, who was cowering behind a server rack. He picked her up. She buried her face in his neck. "Is it over?" she whispered. "No," Rhett said, looking at the massive Kitsari warship looming outside the window. "The shooting is over. But politics, that nightmare is just getting started." He looked at the screen where Empress Saris was still watching him. He gave her a tired, respectful nod. "Station secured, Your Majesty," Rhett said. "The lunchbox is full." The Empress did not smile, but her tail gave a single approving flick. "Then prepare yourself, Starbreaker," she said, "because I am coming aboard. And I expect you to explain why you fed my niece stew made from synthetic roots." Rhett sighed. "I really need a drink." The silence that followed the battle was louder than the plasma fire. Rhett Calder stood in the center of the server room, surrounded by the smoking wreckage of combat droids and the blinking lights of a rebooting system. The holographic interface of Ledger Prime still hovered in the air, but it had changed. The cold blue aggression of the Cascade Grid was gone, replaced by a steady warm amber pulse, the color of a hearth, or perhaps the color of a certain little fox's fur. The camera drones were still circling their red recording lights, unblinking. They were broadcasting this moment to every screen on Larkspur Waystation, to the Concord High Command, and to the bridge of the massive Kitsari warship, the Sun Eater, hanging in the void outside. Rhett wiped a smear of oil and blood from his cheek. He looked into the lens of the nearest drone. He did not look like a hero. He looked like a wreck. His gray jumpsuit was torn, his cybernetic eye was glitching with static, and he leaned heavily on the console to keep his bad knee from buckling. "My name," Rhett rasped, his voice amplified across the station, "is Rhett Calder. Some of you know me as the mechanic who fixes your toilets. Some of you know me by a different name, Starbreaker. I commanded the 3rd Fleet during the Typhon campaign." He paused, letting the weight of the confession settle. In the refugee quarters in the Spire's luxury suites, and on the bridge of the Empress's ship, millions held their breath. "The starvation you have endured," Rhett continued, gesturing to the scrolling data on the screens behind him, "was not an accident. It was not a logistical error. It was a weapon. The algorithm used by Ledger Prime, the Cascade Grid, was a siege protocol. I know this because I wrote it. 20 years ago, I wrote a mathematical equation to break the will of an enemy population by controlling their caloric intake. I designed it to end a war." He looked down at his hands, the hands that had typed the code, the hands that had saved Kiri. But Herod Vale and the Orion Trade Guild took that weapon and pointed it at children. They turned a strategy of war into a business model. They calculated that your hunger was profitable. They bet that you would be too weak to fight back. Rhett looked up, his eyes burning with a fierce, cold light. They bet wrong. The war is over. The siege is broken. And from this moment on, no child on this station goes hungry. If the guild wants to argue, they can argue with the fleet parked outside the window. He cut the feed. The moment the red light died, Rhett slumped against the console, his legs finally giving out. He slid down to the floor, groaning as his adrenaline crashed. That was very dramatic, a voice said. Rhett looked up. Lady Mira Saren was standing in the doorway, stepping over the sparking remains of a security droid. But she was not alone. Behind her, flanked by two towering royal guards in white gold power armor, walked a figure that made the air in the room feel suddenly thin. She was taller than Mira, her fur, the color of deep midnight velvet dusted with silver, at the tips, like a starfield. She wore no heavy crown, only a simple circlet of woven starlight metal, but her presence filled the room. Her eyes were gold ancient and terrifyingly intelligent. Star Empress series. Rhett tried to stand to offer some kind of formal bow, but his knee locked. "Stay down, Starbreaker," the Empress said, her voice a rich contralto that vibrated in Rhett's chest. "You have done enough standing for one day." She walked over to him, ignoring the gore and debris on the floor. She looked at the console, where the new directive, Priority 1. Child nutrition was pulsing. "You rewrote the core logic," she observed. "You turned a sword into a plowshare in less than 10 minutes. "I just told it to stop being an idiot," Rhett grunted. "Machines are easy. People are the problem." "Indeed," Sarah said. She turned to where Herod Vale was being held by Sari and a group of armed dock workers. The former station master was pale, sweating, and clutching his bitten hand. "And what shall we do with this person?" Saris asked, her tone light, as if discussing what to do with a spoiled piece of fruit. "My niece Princess Kirara has suggested we eject him into space without a suit. She has a very direct sense of justice," Vale whimpered. "I demand a lawyer. I am a citizen of Concord. You cannot—" "I can do whatever I please," Saris interrupted, her voice hardening into diamond. "You conspired with traitors to my throne. You starved my blood. By Kitsari law, I could flay you alive and hang your skin from my command chair." She looked at Rhett. "But this is a Concord station, and you are the man who retook it. I grant you the right of sentencing warden." "Warden?" Rhett asked, blinking. "We will discuss titles later." Saris waved a hand. "Decide his fate. Death prison. The void." Rhett looked at Vale. He looked at the man who had watched children starve from his ivory tower, sipping brandy, while mothers wept over empty bowls. The anger was there, hot and boiling, but Rhett pushed it down. Killing Vale was too easy. It was what the old Rhett would have done. "No death," Rhett said, slowly, pulling himself up to a sitting position. "And no prison. Prison has free room and board." He looked Vale in the eye. "Mr. Vale believes in the algorithm," Rhett said. "He believes that the Cascade Grid is a fair and efficient way to distribute resources. He believes that a person can survive and work productively on 1,200 calories of nutrient paste a day." Rhett turned to the Empress. "I suggest we let him prove it." A cruel, understanding smile touched Saris's lips. "Go on." "Confiscate his assets," Rhett said. "All of them. Strip his accounts. Then assign him a bunk in Sector 12, the labor district. Give him a job in the waste recycling plant, I hear they're short-handed. And set his daily ration allocation to exactly what he gave the children of Sector 9. Rhett leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper that carried across the silent room. "If he survives 6 months without starving, without begging, and without breaking, then he can have a ticket home. If he truly believes the system is fair, let him live by it." Vale's eyes widened in horror. "You can't. That's torture. I won't survive a week down there." "Then you better start rationing," Rhett said coldly. "Get him out of my sight." Sorry, grabbed Vale by the collar. "Move, citizen. I have a shift at the recycling plant starting in 1 hour. Don't be late." As Vale was dragged away screaming about human rights, Rhett felt a strange sensation in his chest. It wasn't a triumph. It was peaceful. The weeks that followed were a blur of activity, a chaotic symphony of reconstruction. Under the joint supervision of the Concord and the Kitsari Empire, the Orion Trade Guild was formally suspended from all operations in the border sectors. Their assets were frozen and liquidated to fund a massive relief effort. Ships arrived daily, freighters loaded with real vegetables, fresh meat, medical supplies, and toys. Larkspur Way Station began to breathe again. The gray, oppressive atmosphere of the lower levels lifted. The air scrubbers were repaired, flushing out the stale ozone and replacing it with the scent of baking bread and blooming hydroponic gardens. The cafeteria in the Interspecies Academy was rebuilt, but this time, it wasn't just a feeding trough. It was a community center, and at the heart of it was Kiri. The little fox princess had become a local celebrity. She didn't wear a tiara. She wore a chef's apron that was 3 sizes too big for her. She led delegations of serious-faced Concord bureaucrats and Kitsari nobles on tours of the new facility. "And this," Kiri announced one Tuesday morning, pointing a ladle at a gleaming new food dispenser, "is the Soup-O-Matic 3000. It does not lie about ingredients. If it says carrots, there are carrots. I checked." The delegation nodded solemnly, taking notes. Rhett watched from the back of the room, leaning against a pillar. He was out of his jumpsuit, wearing a clean, dark gray tunic that fit his broad shoulders better, though he still refused to wear any insignia. "She is a natural leader," a voice said beside him. Rhett glanced down. Sari stood there, her arms crossed. She looked less haggard now. Her fur was glossy, and the sharp angles of her face had softened, though her eyes were still watchful. "She's bossy," Rhett corrected, smiling. "Takes after her aunt." "And her uncle," Sari added slyly. Rhett coughed. "I'm not her uncle." "Tell that to the drawing she taped to the refrigerator," Sari said. "You are Uncle Rhett who fixes the stars. It is a very official title." "Speaking of titles," Sari continued, her tone turning serious. "The messages are piling up. The Concord High Command wants you back. They are offering full reinstatement. Admiral's rank. A fleet of your own. They want the Starbreaker to secure the border." Rhett sighed, rubbing his knee. "I know. I've ignored 5 calls from General Holloway this morning." "And the Empress?" Sari asked quietly. "She has made an offer too." "Human Warden of the Fringe," Rhett recited. "A new position. Independent oversight. Power to veto trade deals. Direct line to the throne." "It is a good offer," Sari said. "It keeps you here, with us." Rhett looked at Kiri, who was currently forcing a Concord diplomat to try a spicy gallow root fritter. "I don't know, Sari," Rhett admitted. "I spent 10 years running from responsibility. If I take this job, I become part of the system again. I become a suit. Maybe a suit with a fancy title, but still a suit. I don't want to lose. Lose what?" "This," Rhett gestured to the cafeteria. "The ground level. The truth. If I sit in a tower, how long before I start thinking like Vale? How long before people become numbers again?" Sari reached out and squeezed his arm. "You are not Vale." Vale looked down. "You looked up. That is the difference." That evening, Rhett was invited to dinner at Sari's quarters. It was a small apartment in the workers' district, clean, cramped, but filled with the warmth of lived-in space. He expected a quiet meal. He did not expect the Empress of the Kitsari Star Empire to be sitting on Sari's worn-out sofa, peeling potatoes. Saris had shed her armor and her robes. She wore a simple, loose-fitting tunic of dark blue linen. Her feet were bare, her claws retracting rhythmically as she worked the paring knife with surgical precision. She looked exhausted, but her eyes were bright with amusement as Rhett froze in the doorway. "Close the door, Rhett," Sarah said without looking up. "You are letting the draft in, and this stew needs to simmer at a constant temperature." Rhett blinked. "Your Majesty, I didn't know you did vegetables. I led a guerrilla campaign in the swamp moons of Zar before I took the throne," Sarah said, tossing a peeled potato into a pot. "I can skin a mud lizard in 30 seconds. A potato is significantly less dangerous." Kiri ran out of the bedroom holding a stack of paper. "Uncle Rhett Auntie Saris is teaching me how to make spy codes." "Royal ciphers," Saris corrected gently. Spy codes are for amateurs. Go wash your paws, little one. Dinner is in 10 minutes. Rhett sat down at the small, wobbly table across from Saris. The room smelled of spices and savory broth. It was surreal. The most powerful woman in the galaxy was cooking dinner in a room that was smaller than her shoe closet. "Why are you here, Saris?" Rhett asked quietly, dropping the formalities. "Because the food on my flagship is terrible," Saris replied, wiping her hands on a towel. "Nutritionally perfect but soulless. And because I wanted to talk to you without 20 guards breathing down my neck." Sari brought a bottle of cheap synthetic wine to the table and poured 3 glasses. "She snuck out through the waste disposal chute," Sari grinned. "My sister the Empress crawling through a garbage tube. I wish I had taken a picture." "It was a tactical exfiltration," Saris sniffed, taking a sip of the wine. She grimaced. "By the stars, Sari, this tastes like engine coolant." "It is the finest vintage Sector 12 has to offer," Sari laughed. They ate. The stew was simple, hearty, and delicious. For a while, they didn't talk about politics or algorithms. They talked about the leaking faucet in the bathroom. They talked about Kiri's math homework. They joked about Rhett's inability to fit his legs under the tiny table. It felt normal. And that terrified Rhett more than any battle. After dinner, Sari took Kiri into the bedroom to read a bedtime story, leaving Rhett and Saris alone in the small living area. Saris walked to the single small viewport that looked out over the station's hull. She stared at the stars, her posture slumping slightly. The mask of the Empress slipped, revealing a woman who carried the weight of 1,000,000,000 lives. "You haven't accepted my offer," Saris said softly. Rhett joined her at the window. "I haven't accepted Concord's offer either." "Why?" "Fear," Rhett admitted. "I'm afraid that if I put on a uniform again, I'll stop being Rhett. I'll just be the Starbreaker again. And the Starbreaker breaks things. I want to fix things." Saris turned to him. Her golden eyes searched his face. "Do you think I wanted this crown?" she asked. "I wanted to be a xenobiologist. I wanted to study moss on distant moons. But my brother died. My niece was hunted. I took the throne because there was no one else who could hold it without crushing it." She reached out and touched the scar on Rhett's cheek. "I do not need another General Rhett. I have 1,000 generals. They are very good at saluting and very bad at thinking. They tell me what I want to hear. They treat people like resources." She stepped closer, invading his personal space in a way that made his heart hammer against his ribs. "I need a warden who understands hunger. I need a man who looks at a spreadsheet and sees a starving child. I need someone who is not afraid to stand in my throne room and tell me that I am wrong." "You want me to argue with you?" Rhett asked, a half-smile tugging at his lips. "I require it," Saris said intensely. "A ruler without a conscience is a tyrant. You, Rhett Calder, are the most annoying, stubborn, insubordinate conscience I have ever met. And I cannot rule this border without you." Rhett looked at her. He saw the loneliness behind the power. He saw the woman who had crawled through a garbage chute just to eat bad stew and feel human for an hour. "The job title," Rhett said. "Human Warden of the Fringe. It sounds pompous." "We can change it," Saris shrugged. "Keeper of the Lunchbox. His grumpiness, the royal fixer." Rhett laughed. "Warden is fine, but I have conditions." "Name them." "I stay here, on Larkspur. I don't live in the capital. I don't wear a dress uniform. I live in Sector 9. I eat in the cafeteria. And if the Concord or your empire tries to pull a stunt like this again, I have the authority to shut down the entire sector. No questions asked." "Agreed," Saris said instantly. And, Rhett hesitated, looking toward the bedroom door where Kiri was sleeping. "And I want backup. I can't do this alone." "You have Sari," Saris said. "And you have me." "You're the Empress," Rhett said. "You're light years away." "Not always." Saris stepped even closer, her voice dropping to a murmur. The warp drive on the Sun Eater is very efficient. I can be at Larkspur in 4 hours. For diplomatic inspections. Diplomatic inspections, Rhett repeated. Is that what we're calling them? Unless you prefer clandestine culinary reviews. Sarah smiled. It was a real smile, stripping away years of courtly frost. Rhett looked at her. Really looked at her. He saw the partner she was offering to be. Not a superior officer. Not a distant monarch. An equal. I think I could get used to inspections, Rhett said. Saris leaned in her forehead, resting lightly against his. It was a Kitsari gesture of trust, exposing the vulnerable connection between the ears. Rhett didn't pull away. He leaned back, closing his eyes, feeling the warmth of her presence anchoring him. Good, Saris whispered. Because I am not looking for a hero to kneel at my feet, Rhett. I have plenty of statues for that. I am looking for a man who will stand beside me and tell me when I have spinach in my teeth. You don't have spinach, Rhett murmured. But you do have a little potato peel on your shoulder. Saris laughed, a low, throaty sound that vibrated through him. She brushed his shoulder with her hand. Then we are a match. The Empress and the mechanic. The tabloids will have a field day. Let them talk, Rhett said. As long as they spell my name right. The door to the bedroom creaked open. Kiri stood there rubbing her eyes, holding a piece of paper. Are you two kissing? She asked loudly. Rhett and Saris sprang apart like two teenagers caught by a parent. No, Rhett said quickly. We were discussing geopolitical strategy, Saris said, smoothing her tunic. Kiri rolled her eyes. Adults are weird. She walked over and shoved the paper into Rhett's hand. I finished the drawing. It is for the office, the new office. Rhett looked at the drawing. It was done in crayon, but the lines were bolder now, more confident. It showed a house, sitting on a hill, but the hill was actually an asteroid. Above the house, 2 flags waved, the blue and gold of the conquered and the silver and black of the Kitsari. Standing in front of the house were 4 figures. There was a small orange fox, Kiri. There was a red fox with a wrench, Sari. There was the tall black fox with the crown, Saris. And there was the gray human, with the grumpy eyebrows, Rhett. They were holding hands. Underneath, in messy, blocky letters, Kiri had written, Operation Family. Rhett felt a lump form in his throat. He looked at Saris, who was peering over his shoulder. The Empress's eyes were glistening. It is a good operational plan, Saris said softly. Very robust. Needs more defense turrets, Rhett joked weakly, wiping his eyes. But I think we can approve it. Sari came out of the bedroom, leaning against the doorframe with a knowing smirk. So, is the geopolitical strategy concluded? Because I have dessert. Stale sweet buns from the vending machine. My favorite, Sarah said, sitting back down on the sofa and patting the space beside her. Come, Warden, sit. The dishes can wait. Rhett looked at them. Sari, the fierce protector. Kiri, the hope of the future. Saris, the lonely ruler finding her way home. He realized he wasn't afraid of the machine anymore. He wasn't afraid of the system. Because he had built a new system. A system of 4 people held together, not by an algorithm, but by messy, complicated, stubborn love. I'm not doing the dishes, Rhett grumbled, sitting down next to the Empress of the galaxy. I'm the Warden. I have diplomatic immunity. I am the Empress, Saris countered, breaking a sweet bun in half and giving him the bigger piece. I can revoke your immunity. Eat your bun, Rhett. Yes, ma'am, Rhett said. He took a bite. It was stale. It was dry. It was the best thing he had ever tasted. Outside the window, Larkspur Way Station drifted in the endless night, no longer a place of hunger, but a beacon. And inside the small room, for the first time in 100 years, the Starbreaker was not planning a war. He was planning breakfast. The peace had finally begun. 3 months later, the air in Larkspur Way Station tasted different. It no longer smelled of recycled ozone and despair. It smelled of baking bread, fresh hydroponic basil, and the crisp, clean scent of efficient ventilation systems that were finally operating at 100% capacity. The gray, oppressive smog that had hung over the lower sectors for a decade had been scrubbed away, replaced by a clarity that made the artificial lights of the station thoroughfares gleam like real sunlight. Rhett Calder sat at a table in the middle of the expanded Sector 9 cafeteria. He was surrounded by noise, but it was the good kind of noise, the clatter of trays, the laughter of children, and the rhythmic thrum of the new food synthesizers, churning out meals that actually contained vitamins. He looked down at his datapad, scrolling through the logistics report for the morning shift. Sector 4. Distribution complete. Nutritional variance, 0.2%. Surplus allocation, directed to visiting refugee transport. "You are furrowing your brow again, Uncle Rhett," a voice chirped from across the table. "It will give you wrinkles. More wrinkles. Deep ones." Rhett looked up. Kiri was sitting opposite him attacking a bowl of noodle soup with the ferocity of a starving wolf, though she certainly wasn't starving anymore. Her orange fur was thick and glossy, her eyes bright and clear. She wore a chef's apron that had been embroidered with gold thread, a gift from a mysterious admirer in the spire, and she looked every inch the manager of the establishment. "I'm not furrowing," Rhett grunted, tapping the screen. "I'm analyzing. The supply chain from the beta system is lagging by 2 hours. If I don't adjust the docking schedule, the fresh fruit shipment will sit in quarantine over the weekend." "Let the fruit sit," Kiri dismissed with a wave of her spoon. "Fruit is patient. You need to eat your sandwich. It has real tomatoes. Sari says tomatoes are good for the heart." Rhett looked at the sandwich on his tray. It did indeed have real tomatoes. Red, juicy, and impossibly expensive by the standards of the old Larkspur. "Sari worries too much," Rhett muttered, but he picked up the sandwich. As he took a bite, he noticed the stares. They were constant now. Humans, Kitsari and heavy worlders, walked past the table, nodding respectfully. Some whispered behind their hands. "That is him," a Kitsari dock worker murmured to his mate. "The human warden. The one who broke the algorithm." "He looks tired," the mate replied. "He carries the weight of the station," the first one said solemnly. "My cousin in the fleet says he stood down an entire Orion security squad with a wrench and a bad knee. They say he told the Empress that her math was wrong." Rhett sighed. The stories were getting wilder. Last week, rumor had it that he could shoot lasers from his cybernetic eye. But beneath the gossip, there was a shift in the way the aliens looked at him. It wasn't the usual suspicion or fear directed at humans. It was respect. For years, the narrative in the border sectors had been simple. Humans were conquerors. Humans were efficient, cold, and dangerous. They built algorithms like Ledger Prime to squeeze the life out of worlds. Rhett had flipped the script. He had shown them that human stubbornness could be a shield as well as a sword. He had proven that a human would burn down his own creation if it meant saving a child who wasn't even his own species. "Eat," Kiri commanded, kicking him gently under the table. "Or I will tell Lady Mira you are skipping meals." "I am eating," Rhett said around a mouthful of tomato. "And don't tell Mira anything. She's already threatening to send me a personal nutritionist." "She likes you," Kiri giggled. "She draws hearts in the margin of her reports." "I saw them." Rhett choked on his sandwich. "She does not." "She does little silver hearts, with spikes." "Those are probably caltrops," Rhett said, wiping his mouth. "She's a tactician. She draws weapon schematics." But he smiled. He couldn't help it. The station was safe. The kids were fed. And somewhere in the high orbit of the spire, a silver-furred Kitsari diplomat was probably looking at a report and thinking about him. Life was complicated, but it was good. The peace, however, was merely the prelude to the final act of justice. 2 days later, the Grand Tribunal convened in the central hangar of Larkspur. The massive space usually reserved for repairing capital ships had been transformed into a courtroom of galactic proportions. Flags of the human Concord and the Kitsari Star Empire hung from the rafters, blue and gold, intertwined with silver and black. A massive holographic dais dominated the center of the room where the judges sat. On the left, High Adjudicator Vance of Concord, a stern man with a face like carved granite. On the right, wearing the full ceremonial armor of the Star Empress, sat Ceres. She looked terrifying and magnificent, her golden eyes scanning the crowd with the intensity of a targeting laser. And in the middle, sitting in a simple chair, was Rhett Calder. He wore his new uniform, a dark gray tunic with no rank insignia, only a silver pin on the collar shaped like a shield. The warden. In the dock stood Herod Vale and 5 other high-ranking executives of the Orion Trade Guild. They looked diminished, stripped of their expensive suits, wearing plain gray prisoner jumpsuits. They looked like what they truly were, small men who had cast long shadows, only because they stood on piles of money. The charges were read aloud by a court scribe. Herod Vale, the scribe intoned. You are charged with gross negligence, 47 counts of resource embezzlement violation of the Interstellar Humanitarian Accords, and 3,212 counts of endangerment of minors. Vale stood up. He was shaking, but he tried to muster some of his old arrogance. This is a farce. I operated within the parameters set by the Concord economic charters. The algorithm. Rhett interrupted, his voice amplified by the room's acoustics. Was designed for war. You used it for profit. That is not a defense, Vale. That is a confession. I demand to speak to my legal counsel, Vale shouted. You cannot hold me here. I am a citizen of the core worlds. Empress, Ceres leaned forward. Her voice was low, but it silenced the hanger instantly. We are not finished with the list of charges, Herod Vale. She gestured to the side entrance. Bring in the witness. The heavy doors hissed open. Sari walked in. But this was not the Sari that Rhett knew. This was not the welder in the stained jumpsuit with grease under her claws. She wore the midnight blue armor of the Kitsari Royal Guard. A silver cloak flowed from her shoulders. Her head was held high, and at her hip hung a ceremonial vibroblade that marked her as a protector of the blood royal. The crowd gasped. Rhett blinked, sitting up straighter. He knew Sari had secrets she moved too quietly for a dock worker. But this, witness, state your name and rank for the record, Ceres commanded. I am Sari Elvain. Sari, said her voice ringing clear. Lieutenant Commander of the Crimson Guard, former personal shield to the House of Ceres. Vale's face went from pale to a sickly shade of gray. I don't know this woman. Do you not? Sari walked toward the dock. 7 years ago, you accepted a contract from a radical faction within the Kitsari borders, the Red Tail Cabal. They paid you 20 million credits to destabilize the border region. They wanted to force the Empress to abdicate by proving she could not protect her people. She stopped 3 meters from Vale. But that was not enough for you. You sold them tracking data. You helped them hunt down survivors of the coup attempt on the colony of Gamma 4. You helped them hunt for the missing heir. Rhett felt a cold chill run down his spine. Gamma 4. The colony he had saved. The colony where he had disobeyed orders to let the civilians escape. The heir, Adjudicator Vance asked, frowning. I was not aware there was a missing heir. There was, Ceres said. She stood up. And she has been hiding in plain sight, starving in a cafeteria run by a thief. Ceres gestured again. The doors opened a second time. Lady Mira Saren walked in, and holding her hand was Kiri. The little fox was dressed in a simple white dress, but around her neck hung a heavy pendant, a 9-pointed star carved from moonstone, the symbol of the princess. Kiri looked terrified. The room was huge and thousands of eyes were on her. She looked around wildly until she saw Rhett. Uncle Rhett! She cried out, breaking away from Mira. She ran across the floor of the tribunal. The guards did not stop her. She scrambled up the dais and buried her face in Rhett's side. Rhett instinctively put his arm around her, shielding her from the cameras. He looked up at Saris, his eyes wide with shock and a sudden burning anger. "Princess Carrara," Saris announced, her voice trembling slightly with emotion. "Daughter of my late brother, the rightful heir to the silver throne." The hangar erupted. Shouts, gasps, and the roar of realization swept through the crowd. Herod Vale collapsed into his chair. No, we didn't know. We just thought she was a refugee." "You thought she was a variable," Rhett said, his voice icy. "You thought she was a number in a column that you could delete." He looked down at Kiri, who was trembling against him. He looked at Sari, the royal guard, who had lived in poverty to protect her. And then he looked at Saris. The Empress met his gaze. There was apology in her eyes, but also a steely resolve. Later, in the private chambers behind the hangar, the shouting had died down. The guards were posted outside. It was just Rhett, Saris, and Sari. Kiri had fallen asleep on a sofa in the corner, exhausted by the adrenaline. Rhett stood by the window, looking out at the station lights. He felt numb. "You knew," Rhett said quietly. He didn't turn around. "You knew who I was. All this time." "I suspected," Saris said. She stood near the fireplace, a holographic simulation of burning logs. "I knew that a human officer had disobeyed the order to bombard Gamma 4. I knew he had allowed the transport ships carrying my brother's child to escape. But the records were redacted. The officer disappeared." "So you watched," Rhett said, turning to face her. "You put Kiri on this station, in the middle of a famine. You used her as bait." "I used her as a seed," Saris corrected, her voice firm. "Kiri had to be hidden. The Redtail faction has assassins everywhere in the Empire. Larkspur was neutral ground. It was dangerous, yes, but it was the only place where she could disappear into the crowd. Sari was with her every second." "I was ready to die for her," Sari added from the shadows. "I had a sniper rifle in the vents of the cafeteria. If Vale's men had ever touched her, they would have died before they hit the floor." "But they starved her," Rhett snapped. "You let them starve her." "We could not intervene without exposing her identity," Saris said. "It was a gamble. A terrible, cruel gamble. I waited. I watched. I hoped that someone would notice. I hoped that the human spirit was not as dead as your politicians claimed." She stepped closer to Rhett. "And then you appeared, the mechanic with the limp. You fixed the air scrubbers. You walked past the cafeteria every day. And one day, you stopped." "I stopped because I was hungry," Rhett muttered. "You stopped because you saw an injustice," Saris insisted. "I did not manipulate you into caring, Rhett. I did not program you to buy that lunchbox. I did not force you to hack Ledger Prime. You did those things because of who you are." Rhett looked at Kiri, sleeping on the sofa. He remembered the empty box. He remembered the fake pheasant. He remembered the feeling of his heart breaking and then knitting itself back together into something stronger. "I felt like a pawn," Rhett admitted. "In your game, in Vale's game." "We are all pawns, Rhett," Saris said softly. "Until we choose to be players. You chose. You could have walked away. You could have taken your extraction fund and left. But you stayed. That was not manipulation. That was free will." Rhett looked at her. He saw the fear she had hidden for years, the fear of losing her niece, the fear of her empire crumbling. She wasn't a goddess moving pieces on a board. She was a desperate aunt who had prayed for a miracle and found a grumpy mechanic. He sighed, the anger draining out of him, leaving only a quiet resolve. "You owe me," Rhett said. "Big time." "I know," Saris smiled, a genuine tired smile. "I owe you a galaxy. I'll settle for a dinner where nobody reveals a secret identity," Rhett said. The sentencing of Herod Vale was broadcast live to the conquered and the Empire. Rhett, stood on the dais, the scroll of judgment in his hand. He looked at Vale, who was weeping openly now. "Herod Vale," Rhett said, "for your crimes against the people of Larkspur, and for your conspiracy against the Kitsari crown, the tribunal finds you guilty." "Please," Vale sobbed. "I have money. I have accounts in the Corps. Take it all. Just don't kill me." "We are not going to kill you," Rhett said. "That would be a waste of resources." He signaled to the guards. "All assets belonging to Herod Vale and the Orion executives are hereby seized and placed into the Larkspur Reconstruction Fund. You are stripped of all titles, ranks, and citizenship privileges." Rhett leaned into the microphone. "You will be transported to Outpost Delta 9. It is a mining station on the edge of the nebulae. It is poor, it is cold, and it is currently suffering from a supply shortage." Vale's eyes bulged. "You will work in the hydroponic reclamation unit," Rhett continued. "Your job will be to shovel fertilizer, and your daily caloric intake will be determined by the Ledger Prime algorithm, specifically the version you insisted was perfectly sufficient for the children of Sector 9. The crowd roared its approval. It was a sound of vindication, savage and sweet. "If the algorithm is fair, Mr. Vale," Rhett said coldly, "then you have nothing to worry about. You will be healthy and productive. If it is not good, I suggest you learn how to imagine a pheasant." "Take him away," Saris commanded. As Vale was dragged out, screaming about the injustice of math, Rhett felt a hand on his shoulder. It was Kiri. She looked up at him, her eyes shining. "Is the bad man gone?" she asked. "He's gone to school," Rhett said gently. "He has a lot to learn." The final ceremony took place a week later. The station was awash in light. Empress Saris stood at the podium, flanked by the Concord High Command. Kiri stood beside her, looking uncomfortable in her royal robes, fidgeting with the sash. "Citizens of the galaxy," Saris said, "today we celebrate not just the end of a famine, but the beginning of a family." She placed her hand on Kiri's shoulder. "My niece, Princess Kirara, will return with me to the capital to begin her training. But she leaves a piece of her heart here on Larkspur." Saris turned to Rhett, who was standing awkwardly to the side, trying to hide behind a pillar. "And we honor the man who saved her," Rhett called her, "the Starbreaker." She beckoned him forward. Rhett walked out, feeling the heat of a million eyes. "Rhett Calder," Saris said, her voice ringing with formal power. "I hereby name you Starbound Guardian. You are the Warden of the Fringe. You are the voice of the voiceless. And you are the shield of the House of Saris." She pinned a medal to his chest. It was not gold. It was made of the same simple battered metal as Kiri's old lunchbox. It was shaped like a fox curled around a star. "This is not a conquered medal," Saris whispered to him, leaning in close. "And it is not a Kitsari medal. I had it made for you. It means stubborn idiot in High Kitsari." "I'm honored," Rhett whispered back. "And," Saris raised her voice, "let it be known that the fate of the Kitsari Empire and the human Concord are forever linked. We are not two species separated by a border. We are one people separated only by the choice to care." She took Rhett's hand and raised it high. The cheer that went up shook the station plates. It was a sound that traveled through the vacuum, a signal that the long winter of the war was finally truly over. The real celebration, however, happened hours later, away from the cameras. It was in the cafeteria. The Kiri's Corner sign was neon now, buzzing cheerfully. A banner hung above the serving counter, free for every kid, no algorithms allowed. The tables were pushed together. Rhett, Saris, Sari, and Kiri sat around a massive pot of gala root stew. Mira was there too, sketching on a napkin. Kiri was no longer a princess. She was just a kid with sauce on her chin. "So," Sari said, leaning back and picking her teeth with a silver toothpick, "the princess returns to the palace tomorrow. Who is going to run this place? Rhett can't cook. He burns water." "I do not burn water," Rhett protested. "I rapidly oxidize it." I have appointed a manager, Kiri announced. Mika, the heavy worlder kid. He has 4 arms. He can scoop soup very fast. Efficient, Saris nodded in approval. A sound logistical choice. And what about you, Warden? Mira asked, looking at Rhett with a smirk. What will you do now that you have saved the galaxy? Rhett looked around the table. He looked at Sari, the warrior who had become a sister. He looked at Kiri, the daughter of his heart. He looked at Saris, the woman who challenged his soul. He realized he wasn't looking for an exit anymore. He wasn't checking the coordinates for his extraction fund. I think, Rhett said slowly, I'm going to apply for a new position. Oh, Saris raised an eyebrow. And what position is that? Dishwasher, Rhett said. I hear the benefits are terrible, but the company is excellent. Kiri laughed and dug into her pocket. I have something for you, Uncle Rhett. For your new office. She pulled out a piece of paper. It was textured, expensive art paper, probably stolen from the Royal Shuttle supplies. Rhett took it. It was a drawing. In the center was Larkspur Station, but it wasn't gray. It was shining silver and gold. Green vines wrapped around the metal spires. Stars twinkled in the background. And in the foreground, standing on the docking bay, were 4 figures. The orange fox, the red fox, the black fox, and the gray human. But this time, there was a symbol drawn above them. It was a shield. One half was the cog and wheel of humanity. The other half was the 9-pointed star of the Kitsari. They were welded together, the seam glowing with light. Underneath, in Kiri's messy handwriting, was a single word, home. Rhett stared at the drawing, his vision blurred. He felt a tear slide down his scarred cheek, but he didn't wipe it away. He let it fall, a final offering to the ghosts of his past. He looked up at the viewport. The stars were out there, billions of them. Cold, distant, indifferent stars. But here in the warmth of the cafeteria, with the smell of stew and the sound of laughter, the universe didn't feel cold anymore. It's perfect, Rhett whispered. He looked at Saris. She reached out and took his hand under the table. Her grip was strong, warm, and permanent. You know, Rhett said, looking at the Empress. Maintaining a cross-species alliance is harder than fighting a war. Yes, Saris agreed, her golden eyes softening. It requires constant negotiation, compromise, and a significant amount of patience. And stew, Kiri added. And stew, Rhett agreed. He picked up his spoon. Well, the starbound guardian said, smiling at his family. Let's dig in. And for the first time in 100 years, Rhett Calder was not hungry.